Do you know the difference between an open primary election and a closed primary election? If you do, keep scrolling. If you don't and you're interested, hang out with me for a sec. We're in the heat of primary season. And since President Trump has been so involved in a number of these primaries, trying to remove sitting Republican members of Congress and U.S. senators that have upset him in one way or another, there's been a lot of media talk about primaries, but I don't think we always have enough time in those spots to discuss the different types of primaries. And so you may only be most familiar with the one in your own area. So just give me a minute and let me run through the differences. Remember, a primary election is when candidates from one party compete with each other to see who will be the candidate to face a member of the other party or parties in the fall election. There's a number of different types of primaries, but they fall into two main categories: open and closed. If you live in a state where when you register to vote, they do not ask you to indicate a party identification, you probably live in a state with an open primary. In an open primary state, when you show up on primary election day, they will ask you, what ballot do you want? A Republican ballot, a Democratic ballot, maybe a Green Party ballot or a Libertarian Party ballot? You get to choose one, and it doesn't matter how you identify in your life. On that day, you make the choice of which election you want to be involved with. And it actually gets a little more granular than that. In some states, it's a public record. Not how you voted, of course, but which party's ballot you pulled. That's the case where I live in Illinois. In other states, they do not keep record of which ballot you pulled. They simply noted that you voted in that election. States that use a closed party system only allow people who are registered as that party to participate in that respective party's primary. And there typically is a date by which you have to identify that you are of that party. You can certainly change your political affiliation on your voter registration, but states and localities have rules about how many days before an election that has to happen. The third type of election you may be hearing about is the runoff. In some areas, lots of them are in the South, you have to have 50% of the votes cast plus one. So in other words, you have to have a majority of votes, not simply a plurality meaning more votes than anybody else. Much of the country, a plurality gets you the nomination or gets you the seat. But in states that require a majority, if no one gets a majority, the top two vote getters have a runoff election. That typically happens a couple of weeks after, up to 4 weeks after the initial election. So that's a runoff. Don't even ask about California. They do it completely different. They call it a blanket primary. Everybody's in one primary, and the top two vote getters will face a runoff if nobody gets more than 50% of the vote. Finally, I just want to say the reason all this matters is because knowing who voted in the election or who was allowed to vote in the election will constrain whatever analysis we try to put on how the general election might go in November. In other words, just because a candidate won handily in a primary doesn't necessarily mean that they'll get great support in the general election, because if it's in a closed primary state, all the voters from the other party were not allowed to participate in that election. Different set of rules, different context, because the candidates will be different. So we got to be careful in extrapolating too much from what happens in a primary election. But I hope that's helpful to you.